Well, our speaker tonight is Dr. Stuart Mathiesen. Stuart is a friend of mine, and it's a real delight to have him here to share his work with us. Stuart took his PhD from Queen's University Belfast a number of years ago. After that, he worked as a research fellow at Queen's and then in Dublin City University for a couple of years there as well. Stuart is well known as an author. His book is Evangelicalism and the Philosophy of Science, the Victoria Institute, 1865 to 1939, published by Routledge a number of years ago. It's now available as a paperback, which is most unusual for an academic tome at a very reasonable price of £30, £31. In addition to his scholarly work, which we'll be learning a little bit more about this evening, Stuart's also a regular columnist in the Irish Times, where he addresses a number of key cultural, sometimes political issues that relate to his current role as a research manager at Intertrade Ireland. Stuart's also a fellow of the Royal Historical Society, and he's going to be speaking to us this evening on a project related to his general interest in the history of fundamentalism in Ulster. The title of Stuart's presentation is The Social Composition and Political Affiliations of the Membership of Apsley Street Gospel Hall, Belfast, from around 1912 to 1914. So Stuart, thank you so much. We are really looking forward to what you've got to say.
Oh, thank you. I think that's the kindest thing anybody's ever said about me in an academic context. So thank you very much. I'm going to try and share my screen now. Let me just make sure that it does share. Can everybody see that okay?
Perfect, thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you. So thank you very much for the invitation. It is wonderful to be here, albeit virtually. I'm at home, where it is also wonderful to be. But it's wonderful to speak to people who are so interested in their own history and the history of things that coincide with my own interests. So what I would like to do with this opportunity is give you a little bit of the context of how I approach this work. I'd like to tell you a very, very brief bit about the historiography that informs the study in the first place. Then I'll take you into the meat and bones, I suppose, of the evidence base, which is the 1911 Census of Ireland. Then I'll pivot a little bit to look at the meeting hall on Apsley Street and what I was able to determine about the congregation there. And then I will draw some very broad conclusions, after which I will invite your very well-informed questions. So, as Crawford mentions, I was a research fellow for a while at Queen's University Belfast, and the project that I worked on was one called Fundamentalism as an Ulster Phenomenon, Popular Protestantism 1859 to 1939. And this came from what sometimes is thought of as a sort of throwaway in George Marsden's classic Fundamentalism in American Culture book. Marsden's main argument is that fundamentalism was an American phenomenon and exclusively almost American phenomenon, because almost nowhere outside of America did you have that particular response to modernity and the interface between religion and politics. But, he said in a footnote, Ulster appears to be an exception. So we set out to see if we could test that hypothesis. And some of the questions that we asked, is there a popular Protestant in Ulster that could be described as fundamentalist? What would that social profile of that popular Protestantism look like? And are other political factors, and we thought principally about anti-Catholicism, would they be important as well? So the methodology combined a series of quantitative and qualitative approaches. We would look at books, sermons, newspaper reports, but the quantitative approach is the one I want to talk to you about today, and that was to use census data and the Ulster Covenant. So the historiographical context for this, I suppose my own interest was sparked by a book by Richard Hofstadter, which is called Anti-Intellectualism in American Life. And this was really the first study that cast fundamentalism in America as it was really a caricature, as a revolt against modernity, anti-intellectual, rural, all the sort of negative stereotypes that you would associate with fundamentalism in popular culture are mentioned in this in this book. So the idea, the fundamental thesis that Hofstadter managed to win the Pulitzer Prize for, much to my displeasure, is this idea of a backward rural agrarian society that struggled to adapt to modern life. Even a southern revolt against science, modernity, and liberal values, and he thought particularly about the role of women. Now, we've had more sophisticated approaches come straight after that. Ernst Sandin, I'm sure, will be familiar to all of you, and his study that highlighted the theological roots of millennialism and how that worked into fundamentalist culture. And then Marsden, who I've just mentioned, who actually looked at the intellectual culture of fundamentalism and showed that it was urban in the northern states, and it was more about a militancy of approach than anything else. I'll just mention very, very briefly a couple of other ones because they're very good books. Revive Us Again by Joel Carpenter challenged the sort of idea that fundamentalism disappeared after the Scopes trial in 1926. My favorite study of fundamentalism actually is Margaret Lambert's Bendroth's Fundamentalist, and it's an absolutely fantastic study about religion and popular culture in early 20th century Boston. And Matthew Avery Sutton's wonderfully illustrated as well, and very, very thought-provoking study from 10 years ago now, American Apocalypse, which reviewed and reconsidered the role of prophecy and end times thinking alongside politics. So that's the kind of background that we're trying to work with. What about the 1911 census? Well, it's very interesting that there was a 1911 census of Ireland and that it's useful to us because at that time the British census didn't ask for a religious denomination. After the 1851 religious census, the census enumerators didn't really like the answer they got and stopped asking. But for political reasons, it was thought necessary to keep an eye on denominational spread in Ireland. So the Irish census continued to ask for religious denomination, and there were 5 separate tabulations of that. One of the tabs is others. So you had your mainstream denominations. You had your Church of Ireland, Presbyterian, Baptist, and Catholic, and so on. And then there was an other category. When you look at the counties, the 9 counties that make up the province of Ulster, there were 53,881 others. And this is how that sort of breaks down. And I've done a comparison with the 1901 census, so you can see the growth both in population and in certain denominations. The census records have helpfully been digitised. The National Archives of Ireland are in charge of them, but they subcontracted this to a Canadian company, and they took sheets that looked like this. This is a PDF scan. Actually, I think of Thomas Andrews, the architect behind the Titanic, who was a Unitarian, and they turned it into this lovely search function. You'll see, interestingly, that there are more than 5 possibilities when you search for religion, but it's still a drop-down menu. There's no fuzzy search option. But what's really interesting, if you search for the others, the vast majority are not what we would think of as non-mainstream Presbyterian, non-mainstream Protestants, but actually misspellings of the most common denominations. So starting with others in Antrim, I managed to narrow this down to 26,866 non-mainstream Protestants. But the most common reason for that is that they were misspelled versions of Presbyterian, so spelled Presbyterian with a P or with a Y, Catholic spelled Catholick, and so on. Or even the use of maybe a descriptive title that didn't match any of the pre-selected options. And that could be anything from Episcopalian to Wesleyan, the Established Church, Anglican, Church of Rome, and so on. And there are literally thousands of these. And this affected not only people like me trying to use that other category to track down non-mainstream Protestants, but when you were using the drop-down menu to try and track down other denominations as well, because you wouldn't have the full number of Church of Ireland or Presbyterian counted on the main sheet. Now, some of these are understandable. Some of them are maybe inexplicable. There's somebody who is apparently an adherent of the religion of Christian Patrick Stewart, who I admire, but I don't think would really be the basis for a religion in 1911. And if you look at his actual census return, what is written is that he is a Christian Science student. So there's transcription errors that further compound them. And this is really important if any of you are interested in following up this approach and trying to find out more about other congregations, other membership lists using this same approach. These are hurdles that you may encounter yourself. And there's another problem with this system, I think, which is that, oh, sorry, I should mention any football fans, I did manage to find a Mohamed Salah, who was a fisherman, or sorry, a fireman on a boat in Derry at the time. But there is another really important problem with the system as well, which is that ditto marks and see above and similar systems were used. Some of these have been accurately recorded, but blank spaces and dashes generally haven't been. And this means that for some household returns, some children are absent. And due to the design of the online census, where you have to search from that drop-down menu, that means it is actually impossible to track the religious profession of those children, except by viewing these individual household returns like I have on screen now. And sometimes this cashes out as, you lose the children in the family. So Samuel Orr and Maggie Orr were findable on the system, but the children aren't. There's another Orr family in Belfast. They list the father as Presbyterian and the mother as ditto. The remainder are filled with dashes, and the parents can be found. Again, the children can only be found. You may find that's quite interesting, but there's something that I really want to pull out for the benefit of tonight's discussion. When I was hunting for some of these missing children, and that makes me sound much more exciting than I actually am, I came across something quite interesting. So this is the Allen family, and they're in a townland called Dunamana. And the parents are described as belonging to the Church of God, while information was refused for the children. You were allowed not to give your religious denomination. Moving across to the Fannin family in Cornegaro, again, we see adults and the older children describing the religious profession as Testimony of Jesus, and the younger children as no sect. And this was a pattern that repeated itself frequently among denominations with similar names, who were generally what we would think of as brethren groupings. And I will stress at this point that I am aware that there are sort of contentious issues around nomenclature, and no offence is intended at all by describing somebody as brethren. It's just a sort of convenient shorthand in this sense. But the really important thing for understanding what this tells us about 1911 and the social profile of non-mainstream Protestants this time is that this is actually, in the census, historical evidence of the importance of conversion experience. The idea that being born again is not only central to your religious identity, but to how you express your identity to the wider world. So the children are not considered Christian until they're not considered to have any religion, in fact, until they have had that conversion experience. And this was, if you look at the age range, something that typically happened in early adolescence. So that digression and all those problems aside, it was hopefully possible to construct a social profile of actually 36,136 separate non-mainstream Protestants. So what can I define? How can I define the social profile from the information I was able to glean? 61% of Ulster's population lived in rural areas. It was predominantly rural population. 24% lived in Belfast. The rest lived in sort of more or less urban areas outside of Belfast. But for this profile of others, non-mainstream Protestants, only 41% were rural. 59% lived in urban areas, and 41% lived in Belfast. And this shows that the number living in non-Belfast areas was consistent between the two. So it's a metropolitan rather than an urban phenomenon. That is, the role of Belfast itself as a centre of inward migration seems to be really important. And that reflects helpfully the information that Margaret Lambert's Bendroth in her study of Boston fundamentalists found as well. Moving on to gender. In the sample that I found, women outnumber men, as they did in the general population. And the ratio of men to women is actually noticeably lower in the sample than it is in the general population. If you look closely at some of the larger denominations, the ratio for each is below the average for the general population. And only Reformed Presbyterians are below the average, above the average for the sample. The Salvation Army shows the lowest ratio of men to women, and there's an interesting hypothesis here that some of the more institutional and traditional denominations may attract more even numbers of men to women, while some of the more pietistic movements attracted a larger ratio of women to men. And further evidence, I think, that might support this is if we look at the mainstream denominations, each, apart from Methodism, has quite a similar ratio. Moving on to employment. This is an ongoing struggle, unfortunately, the way that we class occupations and industry groups. I work in economic development at the moment, and it's still a problem over a century later. But the census enumerators produced a list of 5 broad occupational classes, which I've compared here. They're very broad categories, but they're divided up into 23 orders and then subdivided into 79 sub-orders. So the professions slightly overrepresented amongst the sample, and particularly medics, journalists, engineers, and, as you might expect, ministers of religion. Agriculture, interestingly, is heavily underrepresented. Commerce, overrepresented, especially shopkeepers, office workers, and insurance. Although, interestingly, the large number of people who work for the Salvation Army's life insurance company pulled up that number significantly. And industrial, overrepresented, which you would expect from an urban area and especially from Belfast. But interestingly, they were generally not general labourers, but skilled tradesmen or semi-skilled tradesmen, plumbers, shipyard workers, and textile workers. Very important for Protestants in general, literacy and being able to read one's Bible. The census enumerators calculated the rate of illiteracy in general by calculating the proportion of population who were aged 9 and above and who self-reported as being unable to read and write. Now that figure was 8.7%, which is fairly low for the time, but it does mask significant denominational differences. So looking at Roman Catholics, you have 14.7% illiteracy. Anglicans, or the Episcopalian tradition more generally, just over 6%. Presbyterian, 2.8%, and the others, and that's other as enumerated in the census, not my sample of others, 1.8%. And what's really striking is that the figure for the sample itself is 0.36%, so it's a 99.6% literacy rate. This sample actually have a 21st century Western European level of literacy in 1911 Belfast. And the key here, I think, is the importance in the tradition of evangelicalism and the importance of the Bible. You would expect to see a really strong degree of literacy. It was the first book that most people learned to read. In some of the denominations, the fracturing of them was frequently the result of disputes on matters of ecclesiology or specific doctrines, and this required the ability to understand, articulate, and endorse what to many people would be considered obscure or arcane points of theology or statements of faith or denominational constitutions, and that, I think, is reflected in this really high degree of literacy. And I think some evidence to support that can be found if we look at denominations more closely. So Brethren and Independents had even lower than expected levels of illiteracy. Reformed Presbyterians and Salvation Army had slightly higher levels of literacy. And I think that kind of ties up very well with that idea of understanding and articulating evangelical doctrine compared to Reformed Presbyterian, which was very much a confessional and traditional religion, and Salvation Army, which was more involved in pietistic and social approaches. I suppose I'll mention very, very quickly the Ulster Covenants. This just was a way that we decided we could trace perhaps anti-Catholicism. It was a document signed in 1912. All men over 16 were able to sign, and we decided we could sort of trace signatories against our sample. There's a classic study by David Fitzpatrick called Descendancy that looked at Irish Protestantism at the time, and he decided that his study showed that 77% of the eligible population signed, and he claimed never to have found an unmistakably duplicated signature. However, the rate in the sample that I found was only 39%, so barely half. And I think this shows that perhaps there was a lack of worldliness amongst the sample, or certainly there was no real anti-Catholicism to the extent that might be expected. Now, there are a couple of reasons for that. The sample rate might be slightly higher because even within 17 months, which is the difference between when the census was undertaken and the covenant was signed, people frequently moved. There's an abundant housing supply, for instance. But I think the most pressing is actually the idea of fraud is well supported. I went and looked, and I found lots of examples of fraud when people had signed multiple times. This handsome gentleman is my paternal great-great-grandfather, Alan Mathieson, who signed twice. He lived in Medway Street, which is just off the Newtownards Road in Belfast. He signed the covenant. The sheet at the top is from Belfast City Hall. And you can see his neighbour, Sam Napier, who lived in Medway Street, the house beside him, has signed in exactly the same handwriting. And a sheet from McGain Memorial Church, which is much closer to Medway Street, shows that Alan also signed there, and it's in the same handwriting as a Thomas Nelson. I looked at his census record, and you can see at the bottom there in the bottom right-hand corner that the handwriting exactly matches the signing at McGain Memorial, and obviously Alan has signed for Thomas as well. So that's the context of the original study that I did that performs the evidence base. I was very kindly donated scans of the congregation list for Apsley Hall, and thank you to Crawford for sending that my way. And there were 165 entries on this list. I was able to directly cross-reference from my own sample 103 of those. Looking throughout the 1911 census, I did a rescan through it. I was able to bring that number up to 127. And then going back through the 1901 census and trying to fill in the gaps, I managed to bring it up with reasonable confidence to 136 people, which is a decent, I think, chunk of the whole. So the first thing that emerges is the interesting question of how, and bearing in mind the 1911 census is a couple of years before this membership list was compiled, but it should be fairly close. But the interesting thing is the way in which people expressed their denominational identity. So you'll see that just under half described their denomination as Christian Brethren. The next largest group out of that described themselves just as Brethren. There was 27 of them. And then 10 described themselves as Plymouth Brethren, which is actually relatively unusual in the census. Relatively few Brethren in Belfast at the time described themselves as Plymouth Brethren. There were also 5 Open Brethren, and that gives a total of 79% overall identifying as some variation of Brethren. Other non-mainstream identities include Baptized Believer, Christian, Christian of no denomination, and Church of God. Interestingly, there were also some larger denominations represented. As you might expect, Baptists were at the top, Church of Ireland as well, Congregationalists and Independents, with a smaller number of Methodists and Presbyterians. And those denominations make up 15% of the overall total, and to me that suggests that a significant proportion of the congregation were converts or recent converts. Next, we can look at gender. So there were 59 men that I was able to track down, 77 women, and that gives a male to female ratio of 0.77, and that's remarkably low even by the standards of non-mainstream Protestants. For the Ulster population as a whole, the number is 0.95. For my sample, the evangelical others, the non-mainstream Protestants, that's 0.89, and for brethren overall in the sample, 0.84. An analysis of the ratio for some of the other denominations shows that the more institutional or more confessional denominations, as I mentioned earlier, have more balanced ratios. Roman Catholic, 0.97, very close to the population as a whole. Church of Ireland, 0.95, bang on the average for the population. Presbyterian, 0.94, just under. And among the evangelical others, Reformed Presbyterians, as I mentioned, the most confessional of those denominations, 0.9, Methodism and Salvation Army quite high up, 0.88 and 0.3, so in and around the same as the Brethren. Moving on then to occupation. So I mentioned that the census winners had a 5-class breakdown of occupations. Belfast at the time was the largest city on the island of Ireland. It was a commercial and industrial hub. You had construction, the textile industry, shipbuilding, all really significant employers. And unsurprisingly, none of this quite urban congregation. Apsley Street was off the Donegal Road, Donegal Pass in the inner city of Belfast. None of this urban congregation were employed in agriculture, and actually agriculture only employed 0.4% of Belfast's population, so you wouldn't expect it anyway. The congregation was significantly more likely to be employed than the average population, more likely to be in work, at 63% compared to 45%. And this is observed across both women. So 43% of women there were in work compared to the Belfast average of 31%, and men were 92% were in work compared to the Belfast average of 62%. The congregation was slightly more likely to be employed in professional occupations, the professions, compared to evangelical others, so 3.68% compared to 2.24%, or the Belfast population itself at 2.67%, although I would say the overall numbers are quite small, and from that you would expect a little bit of statistical variation. Now the same is true for the domestic class, so about twice, 4.41% compared to 2.4% for evangelical others, and 2.86% for Belfast as a whole. The industrial class is where we see the largest concentration, 42.65% of the congregation, and this compares to 25.4% of my sample of evangelical others and 33.43% of the Belfast population. Even more heavily overrepresented is the commercial class, 12.5% compared to 4.42% of evangelical others and 6% of Belfast. Now, the occupational classes are themselves further divided into orders and suborders, as I mentioned earlier, and this helps to identify trends. So within the commercial class, the white-collar occupations, bookkeepers, clerks, and so on, are particularly overrepresented, almost 9% compared to the evangelical others generally, 2.9%, and Belfast, just under 3%. In the industries, no member of the congregation worked in shipbuilding, although there were some skilled tradesmen employed in construction. But the largest number of the congregation's industrial workers, 11.76%, of them worked in clothing manufacture, and that's more than double the proportion of evangelical others and of Belfast residents more generally. A large proportion also worked with raw textiles, and while this was higher than for evangelical others at 6.57%, it was extremely close to the actual figure for Belfast. Another sector with a disproportionately large number of workers was in food provision at 7.35% compared to 1.57% for evangelical others and 2% for Belfast more broadly. And this was driven primarily by grocers and bakers. And the final large employment sector was general and unspecified, which is unhelpful. It kind of lumps together managers and supervisors, shop assistants, labourers, and unspecified machine workers. These were significant employers for Belfast residents generally, 7.46%, evangelical others, 7.05%, and even more so for Apsley Street members, 11.03%. And looking more closely at the individual job descriptions, you see a fairly even split between managers or makers and dealers and mechanics and labourers. And this compares favourably to the rates for evangelical others and for Belfast more broadly. One of the really interesting things, and one of the things that does set the Apsley Hall congregation from the rest of the non-mainstream evangelical population more generally, is their origin. So, as I mentioned, center of inward migration from across the island and to a lesser extent from Great Britain as well. And this is reflected in the fact that only 30 of the congregation, so that's around 22% of the congregation, were actually born in the city. However, a majority of the congregation were born either in Belfast or in the neighbouring counties of Antrim and Down. So at 57%, this is still lower than the figure for Belfast as a whole, which is about 78%, and lower than for the evangelical other category at about 75%. Most of the congregation did, however, come from the 9 Ulster counties, 83% of them, or 113 of them. And this means that an unusually large number, or 35 of them, came from those Ulster counties which were not adjacent to Belfast. Only 11% of the population in Belfast came from other Ulster counties, but in the Apsley Street congregation, this figure is 26%. And that's higher than it is for the evangelical other population as well. Most of these came from Armagh and Monaghan, but there are also a relatively high number of members from the other Irish provinces at about 8%. This is considerably higher than for the evangelical other population, 1.5%, and for Belfast as a whole at 3%. I think that says an interesting thing about the networks in which brethren people moved and members of the congregation would have moved. There were no members who came from outside the United Kingdom. 12 members came from Great Britain, which is slightly higher than the average would have been for Belfast at 7%. The figures for evangelical others and Belfast itself in terms of extra UK population were both lower than 1%, and it's not entirely unexpected in a population of 165 that you would see 0. So when we put all that together, what can we say about non-mainstream Protestants in Edwardian Belfast, and more specifically, what can we say about the Apsley Street Hall, the Hall congregation? I think it's a really important case study of the evangelical others. For any of you who would like to do a little bit more research into how the census could be used to really enrich your studies and provide really important demographic data behind it, the census digital records are fantastic. There are technical challenges, and I hope I've given you a real sense of what you would be up against. If you run into those challenges, at least you're going in with your eyes open, and I certainly, if you'd like to follow up with me, would be happy to give you a little bit of help where I could. The inclusion of religious denomination, which is unusual in a census at that time, allows a really unparalleled opportunity to construct a social profile. You could not do this with the censuses for Glasgow or Liverpool or Plymouth or anywhere like that at the time. The picture that emerges from this social profile is of a culture that's highly literate, overrepresented in commerce and trade. It's almost a sort of petty bourgeois culture. It's highly urban, and in many ways that's a contrast to all of the horrible stereotypes that Richard Hofstadter set out in Anti-Intellectualism in American Culture. So from that sense, I found this study overall, and particularly Apsley Hall, really encouraging and really satisfying, because it was a way to demonstrate how crude those stereotypes were. The congregation that forgive me, I've misspelled Apsley Hall there. The congregation at Apsley Hall does broadly reflect the overall non-mainstream evangelical colour, but it has a wider than expected geographic spread, and that's something I'd love to think about a little bit more, how the 1911 census of Ireland could be used to trace some of those networks in future. So that's all I have to say to you on that. I hope you found that interesting and helpful, and I would love to talk a little bit more if you have any questions that I can help with.
Stuart, we are clapping spiritually, and thank you very much for sharing that. That was a wonderful presentation. We have time for questions, as Stuart says. Neil, can we start with you? Neil Dixon. If you want to unmute yourself, ask your question, and then perhaps mute yourself again just for ease, that would be great.
Thanks very much, Stuart, for a fascinating paper. As chance would have it, I was given an address list for a Brethren assembly in Glasgow, which is within 200 yards of where I now live. Although I didn't know that at the time when I was given the address list. And it was for 1911, and fortunately someone at Glasgow University had gone through all the census returns for 1911 and detailed absolutely every day on a printer, one of the old computer things, remember?
Yeah, the microfiche.
Rolls of paper, and it's now in the Mitchell Library. So I was able to go through that and identify a fair large chunk of the congregation. And it was not dissimilar to what you found in Belfast. I should have turned the page up for that same period. To see if I can get the page. Sorry, I should have looked this up earlier. Right, so I've got so many tables, I'm trying to find the one that it came out as. Here it is here. So I found 2% belong to, I was classifying it by sort of earlier 20th century social classification. So about 2% were in social class 1, in the upper social class. 20% were coming out in, 19.6% were coming out in sort of lower middle class. And then skilled working class was coming out at 62.7%. So about 2/3 of the congregation almost. 5.9% coming out as unskilled working class, and 9.8% as unskilled, unskilled working class. So it was roughly pretty well what you're finding there, you know, the
not dissimilar at all. Yeah.
Fairly roughly, which is quite interesting. It was another urban congregation. So that possibly suggests that could have played out across the Brethren generally in the United Kingdom.
Absolutely.
In other words, what you're finding about the Brethren there is not unique to Belfast, but the Glasgow figures support it as roughly equivalent.
It's really encouraging to know that I didn't do it wrong. I didn't waste my time. Thank you. That's fascinating. I'd love to actually take a look at the Glasgow, because you know they're only 100 miles away. Very, very similar cultures, very similar political and social issues as well. So you would expect that they would be the most directly comparable cities.
Do you want to scan the? Do you want me to scan the address list for you? I've got a photocopy of it still here. But was that used to you?
If it's not too much trouble, I'd love to take a look. Yes, thank you.
And it may take me some time to get around to it, but I can do it.
Okay.
Yeah. The actual thesis is online if you search for it.
Okay. I'll take a look. It's on Glasgow Archive, I think.
No, it's on Stirling University Archive.
Oh, Stirling. Okay.
Stirling University.
Thank you, Neil Dixon. Tom Marinello has his hand up next, I think.
Yep. Okay. Thank you, Stuart. It was a fascinating dive into the social background and of the hall. I have a couple of questions.
Sure.
You say there were no shipbuilders, so it brings up something. Would another Brethren Hall have them, or was there a particular religious group that were primarily the shipbuilders? That's the first question.
No, I think this is a question of geography. Apsley Street is in south central Belfast. Predominantly, the shipbuilders were in East Belfast because that's where the shipyards were. But I did take a look at the streets around, and there were people who were employed in the shipyards in nearby streets. So what to me that suggests is not that there was an aversion to shipbuilding or another religion was the shipbuilders, but simply that because the social profile of the congregation didn't have that many people in those kind of trades anyway, and it was more towards the petty bourgeois end of things, that was why. So if it was a larger congregation, maybe you would have had a couple.
Okay, and then the other question is related again, like you say, the petty bourgeois. This is the late 80s. My experience in the northern part, living in the northern part of Northern Ireland, was that the leadership was from what you would call, of the assembly, was from what we'd call that first level class.
Mm-hmm.
Were you able to do any comparison, or did you do any work that showed what class led that local church?
No, I don't actually know the leadership. It's a fascinating question. Maybe Crawford, you would be able to point who the leadership was. No idea. It would be fascinating to find out who the leadership was, and compare them. But certainly, I didn't take that approach. I can have a look and see if I can drill up any explanation and get back to you on it.
No, that's okay. I just wondered if it's outside what you presented, but I just wondered if you happen to run across it. That's fine.
Okay.
Thank you again.
Neil Somerton has a question, but just before we go there, Stuart, it's interesting to think about this hall as existing in what I suppose would have been quite a working class part of Belfast at that point. But the people who are coming to it are sometimes coming from a street away, as in the case of the Gribbons, or up to half a mile away or thereabouts from more salubrious.
Yeah, so I think what the most interesting one was a lady of independent means. She described herself, who had a house in Dalkey in Dublin as well. She didn't turn up in the 1911 census. I had to track her down the whole way to 1901 in Dublin. And this is somebody who would have been very, very wealthy. She was widowed. So there's a real, I do find it interesting because I'm sure you've been down to Apsley Street fairly recently. It's not the most pleasant area for a lady to be walking around on her own in. So it says that, yes, absolutely, it's a working class area. There are skilled working class people making up the majority of people there, but people are coming from quite significant distances. I'd love to plot it onto a map and see where everybody was coming from. There's a project for another day, perhaps.
Brilliant. Thank you, Stuart. Neil Somerton, you have a question for us.
Thank you, Crawford. You rather tantalized me, anyway, with the covenant and the fact that you had your own forebears who had signed it and
yes,
seemingly followed the Ulster principle of voting early and voting often. But did you correlate your 136
yes.
with signature of the covenant? What were the proportions, and did they differ from other evangelical and non-evangelical groups?
Yes, sorry, I thought in one sense that wasn't the most interesting part of it, but I have the numbers handy here. Bear with me a second. So there were 59 members were eligible to sign the Ulster Covenant. 59 of the members that I identified were men over the age of 16. Of those, 18 signed, so that's 31%. And that's slightly lower than the rate for the evangelical others generally at 37-ish%. And it's exactly the rate for brethren in Ulster overall. So it's really consistent amongst brethren congregations. It is slightly lower than the rate for non-mainstream evangelicals in Belfast at 32%. And of those who were eligible to sign the covenant and who on the census described themselves as one of those variations of brethren, 50% did. So only one Plymouth Brethren did and no Open Brethren did. So the majority of those who did sign were ones who described themselves just as brethren or Christian brethren. One of the Episcopalian people signed, as did one Baptist, and the single eligible and Methodist members did as well. So people who described as brethren were much, much less likely to sign the covenant than any of the other comparable categories, whether that's being based in Belfast, being a non-mainstream Protestant, being a non-mainstream Protestant in Belfast.
So approaching a third signed. I mean, it is interesting that it may not be significant, but there is a difference between those who said they were brethren signing and others. But this doesn't look, it's quite a high level for a group that on the whole eschewed involvement in political life.
I was quite surprised by the numbers that I found, and when I looked at the main that survey of that sample of 36,136 people, the main sample, the one that Brethren surprised me, and the other denomination that surprised me were Reformed Presbyterian, because these are people who self-describe as covenanters and hold to the other covenant, and were were instructed to obey worldly magistrates and so on. So it all seemed it was a very, very high proportion given those conditions, and the same for brethren.
I suppose what makes that especially interesting is that both those groups, Stuart, were groups that abstain from politics on principle.
Yes, in general, yeah.
However, it did relate to signing the covenant, and the particular issues were very much Irish questions, and I observed some very down the line brethren leaders in the early 70s at the time of the Troubles, and I was surprised, and they were very much brethren leaders. I was surprised how clear their political views were. And indeed, I wondered if they had a firearm in the thatch, which they were prepared to use.
Thank you, Neil. Any other questions? We could raise our hand if we have any other questions. Well, Roger Holden, you have your hand up, I think.
Sorry, I make a comment perhaps rather than a question, because I've been using the Irish census to track down some exclusive brethren in, as some of you know, I'm studying James Taylor, whose family came from County Sligo, and I was interested in your observation that the brethren you've been looking at, the children are specifically clearly separate in that they're not any denomination, or because they're at that age they're not regarded as converted. Now, you don't find that amongst the exclusive brethren. The children are described as same as the parents, and certainly as ones I've been looking at. I just I don't have one up here in a moment. Am I going to shut it down again? Yeah, well, they're all described as brethren. Oh dear, give me a moment. Brethren, commonly called Plymouth Brethren, and then the others for the father, the head of the family. The others are just described under that as being brethren. So, and that includes the children as well. Again, they're variously described. I found some who are describing themselves by the term body of Christ.
Yes.
Yes, that's
Yes.
another one.
Yes, all kinds of descriptions like that.
Yes.
Yes, Church of God and so on. No church
Yeah.
but Jesus. Yeah. No
Yeah.
king but Christ is my favorite of the
Right.
that I saw.
Yeah, because I hadn't realised I started this work how the Irish census did include the question on religion, but the unfortunate thing is that the enumerators' returns before 1901 were all thrown away. Not that they weren't lost in the Custom House fire; they were thrown away before that, which was very careless of them, I thought. So
Certainly.
before that, we've only got the summary
Tables, yeah.
tables. Yeah.
Well, Stuart, just as others may be thinking of a few last questions, can I ask you, why do you think Brethren in Belfast were so attractive to women?
It's just...
And I don't mean individual brethren, I mean the brethren.
Well, no, of course we have you on screen, Crawford, so you know we can infer about your forebears from that. It's interesting. I think there is a degree of the social class. You know, all of these people are very respectable. There's a bit of pietism, and I think there's a sort of community element is something that is suggested and that I infer from the number of people who have come into Belfast from outside the Belfast metropolitan area, as we think, right? If you've got people coming in from Armagh, Monaghan, people coming from Sligo, a couple from Cork, this is an easy way for them to meet with people who know that they will share their theological convictions and that they will be safe amongst. For the non-mainstream Protestants more generally, there were lots of converts who came in and seemed to be, you know, subjected to evangelical campaigning in a sense. This seems to be much more organic, if that makes sense.
Great. Thank you. And Neil Somerton, we might take one last question after Neil's question just to wrap up on time.
Thank you. I wanted to, Stuart, to ask a slightly technical question, I suppose, which was related to the list that you were using from Apsley Hall.
Yes.
And you described it as a membership list. The concept of membership is a little bit contentious in Open Brethren of individual congregations. And I wondered how the list describes itself. Did it describe itself as a membership list, or was it described as a prayer list or people meeting at, as it were?
That is a very good question, and this is one of those instances where I have to say, as I mentioned at the start, I never intend any offence by using shorthand description of these things. I honestly can't remember. I would have to look at the list itself. I don't remember a specific description being given. I think it was just a list. But Crawford, you may have seen it more recently than
I
me.
did. I was looking at it just a couple of weeks ago, Stuart. So there's two lists, Neil. There's one from around 1911, 1912 that Stuart's presentation is based on. And that's a list of those in fellowship. That's how it's described. But there's a second list, which probably comes from the 1930s. And it's a list of those in membership. That's how it's described. Mm-hmm. So that's a very interesting transition from the concept of fellowship to membership. Of course, that could be a decision made by the printer rather than whoever compiled the list, but it's still significant it was being distributed, at least, I think.
It compares interestingly with Cholmondeley Hall in Highgate, which is somewhat, I imagine, socially comparable with what you describe. And that consistently was described as a prayer list. It was, of course, a euphemism for a membership list. And that lasted until into the 1980s.
We actually have another question from Neil Dixon. Over to you, Neil.
Again, it's more a comment. It was just to say that in terms of the women across all the membership lists I analysed, I found 62%, 60.2% in a slightly earlier period than round about the First World War, and it rose slightly to 61.2% in the kind of 30s and 40s of women in membership. The women did tend to predominate. And I think that's in line with what's found generally within nonconformity in England and Wales.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's probably true. Almost certainly true across the board, yes.
So one last question, Stuart, where can we hope to find out more about your work in this area?
In this area, I have been very kindly invited to submit a summary and a tidied up version of, I must say, I do write better than I speak, so don't worry. Excuse me. I've been invited to submit this for the Brethren Historical Review, which I intend to do.
That's great. It goes through anonymous peer review, so no one who reads it will know that you are behind the...
No, obviously not. If you're interested in seeing the results of the overall study, that is in church history, and I cannot for the life of me remember the title of it, but I will find it. It's authored by myself and Andrew R. Holmes. You'll be able to track it down, and if anybody has any problem finding anything that I've written, I do have copies of them. Please, under no circumstances, pay an unscrupulous publisher for publicly funded work that I did. I'd be more than happy to furnish you with a copy.
I should say that if you make sure your subscription's up to date for next year, for 2025, you will be able to read Stuart's paper in next year's Brethren Historical Review.
Fantastic. Good. Well, Stuart Mathiesen, thank you so much again for your time this evening. We know that you have a busy, hectic life, crisscrossing that border, for all the Intertrade Ireland stuff that you do and the writing that you do for the Irish Times and your historical projects. And we're just delighted you took some time out this evening to come and share this work with us. So thank you very much.
It was wonderful, a privilege. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. We are clapping.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Neil Dixon, do we have any information about the next online webinar?
Not yet, no, but we are intending to have one in the spring of next year. Yeah.
Great. Good. Well, allow me then just to close our time together reading the words of the benediction in Numbers chapter 6. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Thank you for coming, and we look forward to seeing you next time.